There's one thing that Kraken fans have either been wanting to have happen for some time, or just wondering when it would happen, or maybe even if, for some of us, since pretty much the start of the new year. But as time went on, it got more and more front of mind, and well, it's pretty much been the only thing that most Kraken fans have been talking about since pretty much the draft, but at least free agency. And finally, we have our answer, as Kaapo Kakko has re-signed with the Kraken just a few hours within a day of the news coming out that an arbitration day had been set. The Kraken, as is what usually happens, avoid arbitration by coming to a deal with Kaapo Kakko that keeps him in Seattle for the next 3 seasons on a contract that will earn him $4.525 million per year, proving once again that the Kraken are actually capable of negotiating and signing pretty reasonable, fair deals, even if it pretty much only happens with players that they're re-signing. So what's cracking, everybody, and welcome back for the news that everybody had been waiting quite some time to hear. And yes, it's the news that most of us expected, and those that didn't, understandably so, were a little bit, well, becoming more apprehensive and maybe straight up anxious the longer it went, the farther into this process we got with Kaapo Kakko not having a new contract with the Kraken. It was pretty clear, I think, since at least the end of January, if not sooner, that the Kraken were going to prioritize, and Botterill made it very clear that they had prioritized getting Kakko a new contract. I can understand maybe some of the angst as to what was going to happen here with Kakko if the Kraken were going to re-sign him, but it was certainly obvious by the time that the Kraken extended the qualifying offer to Kakko, who was an RFA, that they had no intention of letting him get to free agency, and they were eventually going to get a deal done. As far as arbitration is concerned, that's something that is fully within the player's right to request, get that process going, but almost every time the player and team come to an agreement before arbitration starts in earnest, neither the player or team really want to go through that. It tends to be a rather unfun process for both parties, and usually neither one really comes out feeling like they won in that situation. So usually a deal gets done, and that is what happened here. Now, as far as what concessions were made, why the deal took so long, it could be certainly that just the conversation hadn't really started with the Kraken having some idea that there would be a change in general manager and wanting Botterill to have the full go at doing this himself. So maybe negotiations didn't even start until Botterill became the GM. And at that point, you're already partway, a good section of the way into the Kraken postseason. And there's lots of other things with the draft, free agency, all that. So there's plenty of reasons that this may have taken as long as it did. It's also possible that the Kraken wanted to sign Kakko for longer than the 3 years that they got. This 3-year deal certainly does set up Kakko to become a UFA in 3 seasons, right in the middle of his prime at the age of 27, at which point, if things continue to go the way that they have in the back half of his season since he came to the Kraken via that trade midway through, or most of the way through December, just before the Christmas break with the Rangers, if things keep going on the upward trend for Kakko and he starts to realize or re-realize some of that potential that made him a second overall pick, then he certainly could be in for a pretty big payday in 3 years' time. And that's definitely a bet that I think is a good one for him to make on himself, that he can start to refine that and sign a contract worth more than 4.5 plus in 3 years, especially with still plenty of good years left in his playing career. Meanwhile, on the Kraken side of things, they too, obviously, like Kakko, are hoping that things continue to go well and that he continues to progress in that positive direction and continues to refine or continue to show, and maybe even show more than he ever did with the Rangers, that talent that did make him that second overall pick in 2019. And if all of that goes according to plan, I think they'll be more than happy to deal with that looming problem in 3 years of a potentially big payday for Kakko if things go the way that both sides would like them to go. And at that point, it's a good problem to have, and the Kraken will be more than happy to have had 3 years of a pretty good deal at that point for Kakko on this $4.525 million per year, which at this moment is a perfectly fair contract if Kakko does continue to progress positively in the way that he has ever since coming to Seattle from the Rangers. Then that deal will look very good for all 3 of these next 3 seasons. But if he goes back to kind of being the player that he was when he left New York, or maybe even just the player that we saw the rest of this last season with the Kraken, and never really becomes much more than that, then somewhere between $4.5 to $5 million is perfectly fair for that type of player, especially given the cap where it is right now. And as it continues to go up over the next couple of years, even if he continues to produce the way that he did with the Kraken since the trade this last season, then it'll still be a pretty good deal in 2 years' time relative to how much the cap has gone up at that point. But as for right now, even down to all the super stat heads and all the projections and models that do look at what the value of a player's output is, they all have Kakko somewhere around this range, anywhere from like 4.2 to 4.6 million as far as what his expected pay value would be from what he produced this last season. So anyway, all that to say, I certainly wouldn't say that the Kraken overpaid with his contract for Kakko, and I don't think that there's many Kraken fans that would argue that they did overpay. Maybe some Ranger fans that understandably only really remember Kakko for what he was with the Rangers, and things were not going particularly well at the time that he left them, even if there are Rangers fans that are frustrated with how that whole situation developed. But he still wasn't producing at a rate that would have made him worth $4.5 million if that had continued over the course of the rest of the season, and he had reached RFA status with the Rangers at the end of it. As it is, though, he came to the Kraken and significantly improved, as we saw over the course of the last season. He went from, in the 30 games he played with the Rangers, scoring 4 goals and 10 assists for 14 points, to coming to the Kraken and in 49 games over the rest of the season, not missing a game since joining the Kraken, he put up 10 goals and 20 assists for 30 points, so doubling the number of assists and more than doubling the number of goals. And obviously provided much more than that. He did have a significantly upgraded role with the Kraken, playing on what I think was largely considered the first line, with Beniers at center and generally Schwartz on the other wing. But still, obviously, there was a very good change of pace there for Kakko that helped him out quite a bit, and you could tell that his confidence level increased within just the first couple of weeks that he spent with the team. I mean, if you need any more proof at just how much Kakko's game improved since coming to the Kraken, I think this graph on the hockey stat card of Kakko tells a bit of a story. I put a nice red line right down where Kakko joined the Kraken, and you can see that, yeah, the defensive side, we'll get to the defensive side, but the offensive side took a noticeable upturn after the not so good trajectory that it had been on with the Rangers. There's a pretty clear dividing line there where Kakko starts to improve, maybe a little bit of time to get used to the Kraken system, and then things take an upward turn from there. So yeah, I think it's pretty obvious things went better for Kakko in Seattle. And while, again, understandable if Rangers fans might look at 4.5 plus over 3 years and think that was a little bit of an overpay, for Kraken fans, I think a lot of Kraken fans are maybe looking at this and thinking it's even a good deal for the team. I suppose actually, if you were to just look at what he did with the Kraken, considering all those models that project what his value would be, generally look at the full last season, or maybe even averaging the last 2 or 3 seasons. If you just look at what he did with the Kraken, then I think you could make the argument that the Kraken got a bit of a deal here. Now, it's still a small sample size, a relatively small sample size, 49 games, half of a season with the Kraken, so it would still be quite a bit of a risk for the Kraken to bet that he's just going to continue to do that. We've seen plenty of players come to new teams, not just the Kraken, but players get new scenery, get a change of pace, get a bigger role, and yeah, for the first half season to season, things really work out, but then they go back to what they had been before. So for the Kraken, this is playing it pretty safe for 3 seasons, a reasonable deal, and I think there's a lot of upside with this contract and really not too much downside. And that argument gets even easier to make, especially the potential upside end of the argument of this contract gets much easier to make when you remember that all these projected stats and value of Kakko and what he's been worth are largely focused on what he has done individually and don't really take much into consideration the impact he has had directly on the teammates he's played with. In this particular case, as far as the Kraken are concerned, namely Matty Beniers. And the impact he had on Beniers was pretty substantial over the back half of last season, and I think played a pretty big role Maybe not so much in the dollar amount of this contract. I mean, maybe they tacked on the extra 2.5 in that 4.525 because of how he improved Beniers, but I don't think it really improved that much. It certainly, I do think, played into how much the Kraken, as Botterill said, did prioritize getting Kakko re-signed. His Beniers game did significantly improve, especially on the goal scoring end, ever since Kakko joined the team back on the 19th of December 2024. Now, we already looked at what Kakko did, how he improved, over doubling his goals, doubling his assists in his time with the Kraken from what he had done in the first half of the season with the Rangers. But Beniers, all the assists didn't really change much. In fact, he had fewer assists since Kakko joined. The goal scoring took a noticeable turn upwards. As in the 33 games that Beniers played with the Kraken last season before Kakko joined, he had just 4 goals and 13 assists for 17 points, with all but 2 of the assists coming at even strength. He was pretty much not doing anything on the power play. And while the 2 of them did spend some time on the power play, we know that the Kraken power play has not necessarily been a strength, but he did start to score a little bit more even on the power play after Kakko joined. But scoring across the board was much easier for Beniers after Kakko joined on his wing. In the 49 games after Kakko came to the Kraken, Beniers put up 4 times as many goals, 16 goals and 10 assists. So like I said, fewer assists in more games, but that was more than made up for with, again, 12 more goals in those 49 games with Kakko than the 33 games without him, for a total of 26 points. And yeah, 5 goals and 2 of those assists did come on the power play. Actually, I think one of them might have been, well, most of those still came at even strength. And if you go back and watch a highlight package of Kaapo Kakko as a Kraken, you'll notice that there are a lot of primary assists of Kakko passing the puck to Beniers, and Beniers burying it. So it's not even an argument that you can come back and say, well, that's just circumstantial, that Beniers just so happened to start scoring more since Kakko joined the team. It's pretty obvious. Again, you can just go look up a highlight reel from last season, and you can see that he dramatically increased Beniers' goal scoring. In fact, I'm pretty sure he primary assisted on at least half of those Beniers goals in the back half of the season. Now, of course, offense isn't everything, especially with Beniers, where the strength of his game is certainly on the defensive end. And Kaapo Kakko, I wouldn't necessarily say that his presence on Beniers' line improved Beniers' defensive play, and it didn't really improve Kakko's defensive play either. While his offensive stats did improve significantly coming to Seattle, his defensive stats improved, went up and down for the first month and a half, 2 months of his time in Seattle, but then kind of went back to the downward trend that they had had in New York. That having been said, I think a fair amount of that could just be chalked up to pretty much the entire Kraken team having a downward trend defensively over the course of last season, aside pretty much from Matty Beniers, who seemed to be on his own trajectory defensively. But even at that, since Kakko joined the team, Beniers did shoot the puck more frequently than he had before Kakko joined the team, but also blocked more shots, though that's kind of within a margin of error, so I don't know you can significantly say more, but also did play a slightly more physical game since Kakko joined, and some of that I think you could attribute to the influence of Kaapo Kakko with the size and more physical style of game that he plays. Maybe some of that rubbed off on Beniers, or maybe it just became easier for Beniers to do that part of the game when he isn't getting focused quite as much with a bigger winger at his side that also has plenty of scoring potential in his own right, and teams also have to be able to pay attention to what Kakko is doing. And with all that having been said, I think it should be pretty obvious that we should be able to expect that Kakko and Beniers will still be on the same line, or at least start the season on the same line again next year, even with the new coaching staff, some new systems coming in, and I'm sure there will be a shakeup in the lines, probably even throughout the course of the season. But this is a pairing that I think the Kraken are very specifically eager to see how it can continue to progress, and if they can continue to feed off each other and get the most out of one another, either especially at the offensive end, but also maybe a little bit of Beniers' defensive game wearing off on Kakko as well, who wasn't bad defensively last season, but especially as we get into a Lane Lambert system that's going to lean a little bit more on the defensive side of the game. But anyway, as always, I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comment section below. This is a bit more of a deep dive into a re-signing than I would usually do, a whole dedicated video, but especially considering, again, just how focused the Kraken fan base has seemed to be, and rightfully so, over the course of even the back half of the season, but certainly pretty much the entire Kraken offseason so far on when this would happen. It seemed like there was a significant chunk of the fan base that were basically just sitting for the last couple of months refreshing their news feed to see when the news would come across that the Kraken re-signed Kakko. Well, the wait is finally over. You can stop panicking. Kakko will be in Seattle for the next 3 seasons. At least he's under contract for that anyway. We'll see where things pan out over the next 3 years, but at least for now, he is a part of the long-term future of the Kraken, and at least for now, that is what they're saying, that they view him as just that. And so now with this contract signed and Kakko a part of the Kraken for at least the next 3 seasons, that leaves us with this offseason just one more piece of relatively big news that we're expecting. Actually, I guess 2. We're still expecting a 3rd jersey at some point, though that might come closer to the start of the season. But as far as contracts are concerned, and we'll see whether this one gets its own video, but we are still waiting for the Riker Evans extension to come in. He didn't even bother with the arbitration process, but I still would expect that one to be signed here in the near future, especially now with Kakko done. The Kraken are wholly focused on Riker Evans. Also with Ty Cartier having already signed, I think I mentioned that in a previous video, but Cartier signed with a more of a depth deal, just over $1 million per year for, I think it was 2 seasons, if I remember correctly. Either way, the Kraken still plenty of cap space to get Evans in, and then still have a few million left to make another ad if they want to, or more likely just go in not quite at the maximum at the start of the season and see where things go. Until then, though, or whenever the next video ends up coming out, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. Hopefully everything went fine. This is the first time I'm recording a video on a new camera. My previous one decided to call it quits, or at least it needs to get sent in for repair. That's been a whole thing that I've dealt with here over the last little bit. I still actually have to get it sent in for repair, but regardless, hopefully everything went fine with the new camera. We'll have to see. This was a bit of a test run for that. Again, this one largely getting its own video because of all of the hype and angst over this particular re-signing. Let me know what you thought of it, and maybe how this whole experience of waiting for it has gone for you specifically down in the comments. And yeah, until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken.